Billionaire finds a homeless girl at his son's grave. What she reveals will leave you speechless. Every Sunday, Jonathan Mercer walked the quiet path leading to his son's grave. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves, the crisp October wind biting through his tailored overcoat. He welcomed the cold. It gave him something real to feel, something tangible beyond the emptiness that had burrowed itself into his chest for the last 11 years. He had carried the loss like a second skin, a wound that never healed, only deepened with time. His driver, Peter, always parked at a distance, waiting in silent understanding. This part of the routine never changed. Jonathan didn't like being driven straight to the grave. He needed the walk, the crunch of gravel beneath his polished shoes, the solitude among the rows of headstones, the weight of his grief pressing down with every step. Here, in the hush of the cemetery, he wasn't Jonathan Mercer, billionaire, philanthropist, business mogul. He was simply a father, a grieving father, visiting the only place where his son still existed. Michael Mercer, beloved son, may he soar forever. Jonathan's breath came unsteady as the name carved into stone came into view. Even after all these years, it had the power to steal the air from his lungs. Michael had been 17, young, bright, full of the kind of reckless energy that made a father worry and a mother smile. He had his whole life ahead of him until that night when fate took it away. A car accident, they had said, a tragic accident, a miscalculation on a rainy road. But Jonathan had never been able to accept that explanation. Maybe it was because Michael had always been careful, or maybe it was because a father's instincts never truly quiet. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. The past was unchangeable, and his son was gone. As he knelt beside the headstone, the usual tightness gripped his chest. He reached into the bouquet he brought every week, white roses, Michael's favorite, and carefully placed them at the base of the marker. His fingers trembled slightly as they brushed the cold stone, tracing the edges of his son's name. "Hey, kiddo," he murmured, his voice rough. "Brought your favorites again." He let out a slow breath, gathering himself. The words that followed were always the same, a whispered conversation between a father and a son who could never answer. He told Michael about work, about the charities he had funded in his honor, about how empty the house felt without him. No matter how much time passed, the ache never dulled. Jonathan lingered there, lost in memories, Michael's laughter echoing in his mind, the way his son used to throw an arm around his shoulders even when he had grown taller than him. The promise of a future that had been cruelly stolen. But this Sunday, something felt different. It started with the sensation of being watched, a presence at the edge of his awareness. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia, an old habit from a life spent in boardrooms where trust was a rare commodity. But then, in his peripheral vision, he caught the shadow of a figure standing several rows away. Jonathan's muscles tensed. A girl. She was young, no older than 12, her slender frame partially obscured by the trunk of an old oak tree. Long, dark hair tumbled past her shoulders, the deep brown of her skin striking against the muted tones of the cemetery. But it was her eyes that made Jonathan freeze, piercing blue. Unnatural, almost glowing in the fading light. She wasn't crying, she wasn't lost, she was just standing there, staring at him. Jonathan's heart pounded. Something about the intensity of her gaze unsettled him, not in fear, but in a way that felt personal. "Hello?" he called out, his voice firm yet measured. The girl didn't move. Jonathan took a step forward, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. "Are you all right? Are you lost?" For a moment, it seemed like she might answer. Her lips parted slightly, her head tilting as if weighing his words. But before he could take another step, she turned and vanished into the trees. Jonathan exhaled sharply, caught between concern and unease. A part of him wanted to chase after her, but another part, the part that had spent years carrying too many burdens, hesitated. She was probably just a local kid, someone who had wandered too far. It didn't mean anything. And yet, when he turned back to his son's grave, his breath caught in his throat. Resting atop the bouquet of white roses was a single white lily. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He hadn't placed it there. He was sure of that. White lilies were significant, deeply personal. Claire, Michael's mother, had always brought a single white lily to his grave, even after they had divorced. It was her quiet way of honoring their son. But Claire had been gone for 5 years. No one else knew about the lilies. No one but him. His pulse quickened as he scanned the cemetery, searching for any sign of the girl. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches whispering against each other. But the path was empty. The world had returned to silence, save for the distant rustling of leaves. Jonathan crouched down, his fingers hovering over the lily. Its petals were pristine, its fragrance delicate and familiar. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, searching for a clue, a note, a signature, anything. But there was nothing, just the flower, fragile, pure, impossible. His mind raced. Had the girl left it? If so, How did she know about the lilies? Why would she care? A chill ran down Jonathan's spine. He wasn't a man prone to superstition. But something about this felt wrong. Too precise to be coincidence. Slowly, he stood, the lily still clutched in his hand, and made his way back to the car. Peter opened the door for him. His expression unreadable. Everything all right, sir? Jonathan hesitated. His grip on the flower tightened. Just a strange day, he muttered before sliding into the backseat. As the car pulled away from the cemetery, Jonathan's gaze lingered on the grove of trees, his thoughts spiraling into the unknown. The girl's haunting blue eyes, the way she had stared at him, and the white lily, Claire's lily, resting so delicately on Michael's grave. It was too much to ignore. For the first time in 11 years, the suffocating routine of his grief had been disrupted. For the first time in years, Jonathan Mercer felt something beyond sorrow. It was curiosity, and it was relentless. Jonathan Mercer had spent years learning to live with the silence. It greeted him every Sunday at his son's grave, wrapping around him like an old wound that never quite healed. The weight of grief had become familiar, expected, an ache he carried without protest. But that night, as the October sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long across the cemetery, something changed. He wasn't alone. It was subtle at first, a presence at the edge of his awareness. A prickle at the back of his neck. He had never been a man given to paranoia, but something in his gut told him to turn around. That's when he saw her. She stood several graves away, partially hidden behind the gnarled trunk of an old oak tree. The wind lifted strands of her long, dark hair, but she remained still, watching him, studying him. Jonathan felt his breath hitch. She was young, 12, maybe 13, with skin the color of rich mahogany. Her thin frame was wrapped in a worn-out jacket several sizes too big. The fabric tattered at the edges. But what struck him, what rooted him to the ground and sent a chill down his spine, was her eyes. Blue. Not just any blue, icy, piercing, unnatural. They burned against the dusk, glinting like shards of glass catching the last of the dying light. And she was staring directly at him. Jonathan took a step forward, his throat tightening. Hello? His voice cut through the silence. But the girl didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. The way she looked at him, unshaken, knowing, almost familiar, unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Are you all right? He tried again. Are you lost? For a moment, she almost answered, her lips parted slightly, her head tilting ever so slightly. But then, she turned and ran. Jonathan reacted without thinking. His feet pounded against the gravel as he lunged forward, chasing her through the maze of headstones. She was fast, too fast for someone so small. Her slender frame slipped between the trees, dodging low branches and overgrown roots with an ease that made her seem almost unreal. But Jonathan was taller, stronger. His years of corporate battles and high-stakes negotiations had taught him one thing: never let a mystery slip away. Wait, he called, his breath coming in sharp gasps. She didn't. She reached the edge of the cemetery where the woods thickened, and just as he thought he might catch her, she vanished. Jonathan skidded to a stop, his chest rising and falling in heavy breaths. There was no sound, no footsteps, no broken branches. She was just gone. He stood there, staring into the darkness of the trees, his heart pounding. Who was she? And why had she been watching him? He turned back toward Michael's grave, shaken but trying to push the unease aside. But when he reached the headstone, his blood ran cold, because resting atop the bouquet of white roses he had placed moments ago was a single white lily. Jonathan's breath left him in a slow exhale. He hadn't put it there. He was certain of it. The lily was perfect, fresh, delicate, untouched by the autumn air. His hands trembled as he picked it up. White lilies were significant, deeply personal. They had been Claire's flower. Even after their divorce, even after the heartbreak, his late wife had always come here, always placed a single white lily on Michael's grave. It had been her quiet way of honoring their son. But Claire had been gone for 5 years. No one else knew about the lilies. No one but him. His fingers tightened around the fragile stem. The girl, had she left it? But how would she know? Jonathan's eyes darted around the cemetery again, searching for any sign of her. But the path was empty. The only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. His mind raced. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The way she had stared at him, the intensity in her gaze. As if she had been waiting for him, expecting him. It wasn't random. It wasn't chance. She had been watching him. And she had known exactly what to do to get his attention. Jonathan swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the lily. A dozen questions ran through his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Who was she? And what did she know? He turned on his heel, making his way back to the car, the weight of the flower heavy in his hand. His driver, Peter, glanced at him as he opened the door. Everything all right, sir? Jonathan hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Just a strange day. But as the car pulled away from the cemetery, his gaze remained locked on the dark outline of the trees. His instincts were screaming at him. This was not over. Something was happening, something he wasn't meant to ignore. And he wasn't going to. For the first time in 11 years, the numbing grief that had consumed him shifted. For the first time in 11 years, he felt something else gnawing at his chest. Not just loss, not just sorrow, curiosity. And it was relentless. The ride home was silent. Jonathan Mercer sat in the back of the sleek black car, staring at the single white lily resting on his lap. The fragile petals barely moved with the hum of the car. But Jonathan couldn't tear his gaze away. His mind churned with questions, each one tightening the coil of unease in his chest. Who was that girl? How had she known about the lilies? And why had she been watching him? By the time they pulled into his estate, the air inside the car felt suffocating. The towering gates of the Mercer estate opened with their usual mechanical precision, the sprawling mansion looming in the distance. But for the first time in 11 years, the familiarity of home didn't bring comfort. Peter, his driver, hesitated before speaking. Should I? No. Jonathan cut him off, his voice sharper than intended. He pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed. Sorry, just take the night off. Peter nodded, no questions asked. He had worked for Jonathan long enough to recognize when something was off. Jonathan stepped out into the night, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. The mansion stood eerily quiet, its grand windows glowing dimly against the dark. He used to hate coming home to silence. When Michael was alive, the house had been filled with laughter, music, and the careless chatter of a 17-year-old with the whole world ahead of him. Now, all that remained was a hollow, lifeless space, a tomb of memories. Inside, he set the lily down on his desk and collapsed into his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He should let it go. It was nothing, a coincidence, a strange girl passing through the cemetery. Nothing more. And yet, Jonathan reached into his drawer, pulling out a small, worn leather box. He opened it carefully, revealing the last white lily Claire had left for their son before she died. The petals were pressed and dried, but the memory remained fresh, the way she used to kneel at Michael's grave, running her fingers over his name as if she could bring him back. And today, a stranger had placed the exact same flower on his son's grave. Jonathan clenched his jaw. This wasn't a coincidence. It meant something. With a deep breath, he made a decision. He would go back next Sunday. And if she was there again, he would get answers. The week passed in a blur. But Jonathan couldn't shake the girl from his mind. She haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her piercing blue stare. He heard the sound of her footsteps disappearing into the trees, the lingering silence she left in her wake. By Sunday, his anticipation had twisted into something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Restlessness. As Peter pulled up to the cemetery gates, Jonathan hesitated before getting out. He wasn't sure what he expected, if he even expected her at all. Maybe he had imagined the weight of her gaze, the sense of purpose behind her presence. Maybe she wouldn't come back. But the moment he reached Michael's grave, he froze. She was already there. Jonathan's breath caught. She knelt at his son's headstone, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. But this time, she wasn't just watching. She was praying. Her hands were clasped, her lips moving in a whisper he couldn't hear. Jonathan's heart pounded. She had never met Michael. She couldn't have. So why was she praying for him as if she knew him? He took a step forward, his shoes crunching against the gravel. The sound startled her. Her head snapped up, her blue eyes locking onto his. But this time, they weren't empty. They were filled with fear. Jonathan lifted his hands, trying to calm her. Wait, he said, his voice softer than he intended. I just want to talk. But she bolted. Damn it, he muttered, instincts kicking in as he ran after her. She was faster than before, her small frame weaving through the cemetery with an agility that didn't make sense. Jonathan pushed himself harder, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Then, she stumbled. A tree root caught her foot, and she went crashing to the ground. Jonathan reached her in seconds. The girl scrambled to get up, panic flashing across her face. But he knelt beside her, his hands raised in a silent promise that he wouldn't hurt her. Hey, it's okay, he said quickly. She stilled, breathing hard, her hands gripping the damp grass. For the first time, Jonathan saw her up close. Her cheeks were hollow, her clothes too thin for the autumn chill. Dirt clung to her small hands, and there was something in her eyes, not just fear, but exhaustion. Are you homeless? He asked gently. Her jaw clenched. She said nothing. Jonathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. What's your name? Nothing. Then, after a long pause, Lily, she whispered. Jonathan stilled. A strange sensation crawled up his spine. Lily. A white lily had appeared on Michael's grave. His mind spun. He didn't believe in fate. But this felt too deliberate. Jonathan met her gaze again. Lily. "Did you leave the flower on Michael's grave last week?" She hesitated, then nodded. His breath hitched. "How did you know about it?" Lily looked away, her hands trembling in her lap. "Because my mom used to leave them, too." Jonathan's pulse stopped. "Your mom?" Lily exhaled shakily. Her name was Elena Davis. The name meant nothing to Jonathan. But what she said next made his world collapse. She knew Michael. Jonathan's heart slammed against his ribs. The ground beneath him felt like it was cracking open. Michael had known this girl's mother. Jonathan's fingers curled into fists. His breath unsteady. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily swallowed hard. Then she said the words that changed everything. "Because Michael was my father." Jonathan's entire world tilted on its axis. The cemetery vanished. The cold air disappeared. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. No, it wasn't possible. Michael was 17 when he died. He was a kid, still navigating life. He couldn't have. But then he looked at her again. Really looked. And for the first time, he saw Michael in her. The shape of her jaw. The slight arch in her brows. And, most damning of all, those piercing blue eyes. The same ones that had once belonged to his son. Jonathan's breath came in shaky gasps. Lily shifted uncomfortably. "I know it's a lot," she murmured. I didn't come here to ask for anything. She bit her lip. "I just wanted to know if he was a good person." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. Michael, his son, and now, his granddaughter. He had spent 11 years mourning a boy frozen in time. But Michael hadn't been just a boy. He had been a father. And Jonathan had never even known. His vision blurred. The grief he thought he had conquered roared back to life. And for the first time in over a decade, he had no idea what to do. Jonathan Mercer sat in his study, staring at the DNA test kit in front of him as if it were a loaded gun. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its flickering light casting long shadows against the mahogany bookshelves. But the warmth did nothing to dispel the cold knot in his stomach. Across from him, Lily sat in silence, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. Her blue eyes, so much like Michael's, flickered with something unreadable: hope, fear, defiance, as she waited for him to make the first move. Jonathan had spent his entire life controlling outcomes. In the boardroom, he could dictate the course of billion-dollar deals with a single decision. He could forecast market shifts, dismantle competitors, and bend the world to his will. But this was different. This was something he had no control over. Because if this test confirmed what Lily claimed, that she was Michael's daughter, then Jonathan had lost more than just a son all those years ago. He had lost a legacy, a family, a life he should have been a part of. And he had never even known. He swallowed hard, reaching for the test swab with steady hands. Though inside, he felt anything but steady. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Lily didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do." Her response was so immediate, so firm, that Jonathan felt a pang in his chest. She had been alone for so long, searching, waiting. Now, she was here, right in front of him. And yet, he could see it, the way she was bracing for disappointment. Jonathan had spent years grieving the son he had lost. Lily had spent her entire life not even knowing what she had lost. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Then, without another word, he swiped the inside of his cheek with the swab and sealed it in the envelope. Lily followed suit, her movements deliberate, determined, no hesitation, just a quiet desperation to finally know the truth. The moment the test was done, Jonathan felt the weight of it settle deep in his bones. There was no going back now. He looked at her, taking in the defiant set of her jaw, the way she refused to look uncertain even when she probably felt it. For the first time, he really saw her, and what he saw made his heart ache. She was so much like Michael, not just in her features but in the way she stood her ground. Even when the world tried to push her down. Jonathan had spent 11 years living in the past. Lily had spent her whole life searching for answers. Now, everything hinged on a single envelope. The truth was coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were agony. Jonathan had always prided himself on his patience. He could outlast opponents, endure delays and setbacks, and never let emotions dictate his decisions. But this was unbearable. Every morning, he woke up with the same tightness in his chest, the same gnawing thought that by the end of the week, his entire life could change forever. Lily, on the other hand, was a fortress. She barely spoke, barely looked at him. It was clear she had spent years hardening herself to disappointment. Jonathan wanted to tell her that whatever happened, she wasn't alone anymore. But how could he say that when he wasn't even sure what the results would reveal? How could he offer comfort when he was just as afraid as she was? At night, Jonathan found himself standing by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in hand, staring into the flames as if they held answers. What if she wasn't Michael's? Would she disappear from his life as quickly as she had entered it? And if she was his granddaughter? Would she even want him in her life? By the time the phone rang on the seventh day, Jonathan's hands were already clenched into fists. The envelope sat on his desk, unopened. Lily stood across from him, not breathing. The voice on the other end of the line was flat, professional, emotionless. The results are in. Jonathan's grip tightened. And? A pause. Then, it's a 99.9% match. Jonathan's entire body went still. His breath left him in a sharp exhale, his vision blurring as the weight of those words settled into his chest. A match. A match. Lily was Michael's daughter, Jonathan's granddaughter. He barely heard the rest of the phone call. He barely noticed the tremble in his own hands as he set the receiver down. His mind was stuck on one thing, and one thing only. Michael had been a father, and Jonathan had never known. He looked up at Lily, and for the first time since she had entered his life, she looked terrified. She wasn't bracing for rejection anymore. She was bracing for what came next. Jonathan exhaled shakily. Then, finally, he spoke. "You're mine," he said, his voice raw. The second the words left his mouth, Lily's shoulders sagged. The fight left her. Her hands shook. And then, she started crying. Jonathan hadn't expected it, hadn't expected her to break. But she did, and it shattered him. She tried to cover her face, to hide her tears, but Jonathan stepped forward. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, carefully, slowly, Jonathan did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He reached out, and when Lily didn't pull away, when she let herself lean into him, he wrapped his arms around her, and he held her tight, like she was something fragile, like she was something he had almost lost, like she was his family. Because she was, and he was never letting her go again. That night, Jonathan sat in his study. The DNA test results spread out in front of him. His mind reeled with everything he had missed: Michael's secret, Alina's disappearance, the years Lily had spent alone. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. There were questions to be answered. There were truths to uncover. And there were people who had buried those truths for far too long. Jonathan clenched his fists. Lily had spent her entire life searching for family. Now, she had him, and he was going to make damn sure no one ever took her away again. If you're reading this far, support Jonathan and Lily by liking, commenting, and sharing your thoughts. Their journey is just beginning, and they need your encouragement. What would you do in Jonathan's place? Let us know below. Subscribe for the next chapter, because the truth is far from over. Jonathan Mercer had always believed that grief was something you learned to carry, not something you ever truly overcame. For 11 years, he had lived with the weight of his son's death, mourning Michael as if he had been the last piece of his world. But now, sitting across from the granddaughter he had never known existed, watching her shift uncomfortably in the oversized chair of his study, Jonathan realized that his grief had been incomplete. Because Michael had left behind more than just memories. He had left behind Lily. And now, after all these years, Jonathan had to face an unbearable truth. His son had been taken from him twice. First by death, then by secrets. The DNA test had confirmed it. Lily was Michael's daughter. And yet, she looked at him with hesitation, as if waiting for him to change his mind. Jonathan's chest tightened. He had seen this before, the look of someone bracing for disappointment. The way she sat stiffly, hands clenched in her lap, shoulders squared like she was preparing for battle. This was a girl who had learned not to trust easily. Jonathan exhaled, his hands folded on his desk. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said carefully, "and I won't pretend it's easy for me either. But we're here now, and I don't intend to waste that." Lily's gaze flickered to the fire behind him, the flames casting warm light across the room. "You don't have to do anything for me," she muttered. "I didn't come here looking for." "For what?" Jonathan interrupted, his voice gentle. Her hands curled into fists. "For a family." The words hit Jonathan like a gut punch. Because wasn't that exactly what she deserved? She had spent years alone, searching for answers. No child should have to wonder if they belonged. No child should have to beg for love that was rightfully theirs. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Lily, listen to me. You do have a family. You had a father who would have loved you if he had known. And you have me." Lily blinked rapidly, her mask cracking for the first time. Jonathan softened his voice. "And I think you and I both know, there's something bigger going on here." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she nodded, and Jonathan felt something shift. This wasn't just about finding a lost granddaughter. This was about finding the truth. Later that night, after Lily had retreated to the guest room, Jonathan sat alone in his study, turning over the last words she had spoken before she left the room. "My mom didn't just disappear. Someone took her." Jonathan swirled the amber liquid in his glass, staring into the fire. His gut told him she was right. Michael had died under strange circumstances, an accident. They had called it, but something had always felt wrong. And now, Elena Davis had vanished without a trace. A woman doesn't just leave behind her child and never look back. Jonathan clenched his jaw. Someone had been erasing pieces of Michael's life. And whoever it was, they weren't done yet. He picked up his phone and dialed the one man he knew could help. The next morning, Greg Turner sat across from Jonathan, flipping through the files spread across the desk. "You're telling me this girl, Lily, might be connected to Michael's death?" Greg asked, his sharp eyes scanning the papers. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I'm telling you that too many things aren't adding up. First Michael, now Elena. We need to find out what really happened." Greg sighed, rubbing his chin. "You know, most people would let this go. It's been over a decade. Jonathan, whoever buried these secrets, they won't want them unearthed." Jonathan's hands clenched. "Good, let them come for me. I'm not stopping." Greg smirked. "I figured you'd say that." He leaned forward, tapping a name in one of the documents. "There's one lead I can pull. Henry Wilson. He was working for Callaway Industries around the time Michael died. Handled some pretty confidential deals. Then, he disappeared." Jonathan's stomach turned. "Another missing person." Greg nodded. "That's not a coincidence. But here's the thing, before Wilson vanished, he made a large transfer. $500,000. Jonathan's eyes darkened. "To who?" Greg's expression hardened. "Victor Hale." Jonathan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Victor Hale was a name that didn't belong in boardrooms. He wasn't a businessman. He was a fixer. A man who made problems disappear. And he had been paid off just before Elena vanished. Jonathan's voice was dangerously quiet. "Find him." Greg nodded. "Already on it." That evening, Lily found Jonathan in the study, staring at the case files. She lingered in the doorway before stepping inside, her voice careful. "Did you find anything?" Jonathan looked up. Then, slowly, he pushed a file toward her. She hesitated before picking it up. The second she saw the name Victor Hale, she went pale. Jonathan frowned. "Lily?" Her hands shook as she gripped the folder. I know that name," she whispered. Jonathan's breath caught. "How?" Lily licked her lips, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because he's the man my mom was afraid of." Jonathan felt the world tilt. This wasn't just business corruption. This was personal. Elena had known something so dangerous that men like Victor Hale had been sent to silence her. Jonathan swallowed the rage burning inside him. For years, he had thought the worst thing that had ever happened to him was losing Michael. But now, he realized the real tragedy was that he had spent over a decade mourning a lie. Because his son hadn't just died. He had been silenced. And Elena, she had paid the price for knowing the truth. Jonathan met Lily's gaze, his voice steady. "We're going to find him." Lily swallowed hard, but there was something different in her eyes now. Not just fear. Resolve. "Then let's start looking." As the fire flickered behind him, Jonathan Mercer made a silent vow. Michael's story wasn't over. Lily's story wasn't over. And neither was his. He had spent his life building an empire. Now, he would use every bit of power he had to tear down the people who had stolen from him. This time, he wouldn't be too late. This time, he wouldn't lose. Jonathan Mercer had always believed in control. It was the foundation of his success. The key to building an empire that bore his name. He had spent decades sculpting his life into something unshakable. Something immune to chaos. But this, the discovery that his son had a daughter he never knew about. That Michael's death was tangled in something deeper. Darker, was the first time in his life that he felt utterly powerless. And he hated it. The study was dimly lit, the fireplace crackling against the cold. But Jonathan barely noticed. His gaze was locked on the small leather journal in his hands. The pages brittle from age. The ink faded in places where fingers had traced words over and over. Elena Davis's journal. It was all that remained of Lily's mother. Lily sat across from him, curled into the oversized chair, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She had spent the last hour silently watching him flip through the pages. But now, as his fingers hovered over a particularly frantic passage, she spoke. "You found something." Jonathan lifted his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt afraid of what came next. He cleared his throat, reading aloud. "I saw him again today. He's watching me. I know he is. They warned me this would happen if I didn't stay quiet. But I can't keep living like this. Michael deserves to know. I'll tell him soon. I have to. If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident." A sharp silence followed. Lily's breath hitched. She knew. Jonathan's grip on the journal tightened. She knew. He echoed. Elena had been terrified. And Michael, he had been the reason she was willing to risk everything. Jonathan felt a cold, creeping dread settle in his chest. This wasn't just about his granddaughter searching for a family. This was about a woman who had tried to warn his son. A woman who had never gotten the chance. Because someone had made sure of that. Jonathan closed the journal carefully, his hands steady despite the rage boiling beneath his skin. "They took her," Lily whispered, her voice shaking. "She was going to tell Michael, and they made her disappear." Jonathan's mind raced. He had spent 11 years believing Michael's death was an accident, a cruel, senseless twist of fate. But now, as he sat in the flickering firelight, the truth clawed at his chest, demanding to be heard. Michael hadn't just died, he had been silenced, and the people responsible had erased Elena, too. Jonathan exhaled slowly, controlling the fury rising inside him. He had spent years mourning a son stolen from him by lies. He refused to let those same people steal what was left. Lily. She had spent her entire life alone, chasing shadows, searching for something she thought she'd never find. She deserved the truth, and Jonathan was going to give it to her, no matter the cost. The next morning, Jonathan sat in his office, the weight of the night pressing heavily against his shoulders. Across from him, Greg Turner, his longtime private investigator, leaned back in his chair, flipping through the scanned copies of Elena's journal pages. "This isn't just paranoia," Greg muttered. "She was scared for a reason." Jonathan rubbed his temples. "She mentioned being watched, someone keeping tabs on her." Greg nodded. "And she wasn't wrong. I dug deeper into the files from Callaway Industries during the months leading up to Michael's death. There's one name that keeps surfacing." Jonathan's chest tightened. "Who?" Greg slid a piece of paper across the desk. A surveillance report. At the top, printed in faded ink, "Henry Wilson." Jonathan felt a flicker of recognition. Wilson, he was one of our legal advisors years ago. Handled high-profile corporate disputes. Greg's gaze sharpened. "That's what you thought." Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean?" Greg tapped the page. "Wilson wasn't just some lawyer. He was the board's fixer. He made things disappear. And in the months leading up to Michael's death, he was tracking a specific employee. A woman." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "Elena," he whispered. Greg nodded grimly. "She was digging into something. Jonathan, something big, something she planned to tell Michael." Jonathan's pulse roared in his ears. Michael had found out about something. Something worth killing him over. Something that had made Elena run for her life. Jonathan's hands curled into fists. Someone in his company, in the very empire he built, had been responsible for his son's death. And they had covered their tracks so well that he had never even questioned it. Until now. Greg leaned forward. If Wilson was following Elena, he knew what she found. And if she disappeared right after Michael's death, I'd bet everything I have Wilson was the one who made sure she never talked. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "Where is he now?" Greg's expression darkened. "That's the problem." Jonathan's chest tightened. "He's gone." Greg nodded. "Vanished. Right after Michael died. One day, he was in the office. Next, he was off the grid. No forwarding address. No paper trail. Just gone." Jonathan felt the pieces snapping together in his mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see. The board had been involved. They had silenced Michael, silenced Elena, and now, they were the only ones left standing. Jonathan's fingers dug into the edge of his desk. "I want names," he said, his voice cold. "Everyone who had access to Wilson. Everyone who could have ordered this." Greg's eyes flickered with hesitation. "Jonathan," he said slowly, "this isn't just corporate corruption. If they were willing to kill to keep Michael quiet, they won't hesitate to come after you." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He had built Callaway Industries with his own two hands. And someone inside his empire had used it to murder his son. He would burn it to the ground before he let them walk free. "I don't care," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Find them." Greg nodded once. "Standing. I'll start digging." "But Jonathan." Jonathan met his gaze. Greg's expression was grim. "Be careful. You're not just fighting for justice anymore. You're fighting for survival." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as Greg left the room. For 11 years, he had believed his son's story was over. But the truth was far from over. And this time, he wasn't backing down. Jonathan Mercer had always been a man of power. He had built his name from the ground up, carved out an empire with his own two hands, and turned his company into one of the most formidable corporations in the country. He had fought corporate battles, outmaneuvered rivals, and crushed those who dared to stand against him. But tonight, he wasn't fighting for wealth. He was fighting for his son's memory. He was fighting for his granddaughter's future. And most of all, he was fighting for the truth. The fire crackled in the dimly lit study, casting long, flickering shadows across the dark wood paneling. Jonathan sat at his desk, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. Across from him, Lily sat in silence, her piercing blue eyes locked onto his, waiting for him to speak. She looked like Michael, too much like him. Every time Jonathan looked at her, he saw the son he had lost, the boy who had been taken from him too soon. The boy who had left behind a secret that had shattered everything Jonathan thought he knew. Michael had been murdered. Elena Davis had been silenced. And now, the people responsible were still out there, walking free. Jonathan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "Greg found something," he said finally, his voice low, controlled. Lily sat up straighter. "What?" Jonathan pushed a file toward her. She hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling slightly. As she flipped it open, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a photograph. A man's face, aged and weary, eyes shadowed with secrets. Henry Wilson, the man who had orchestrated Michael's cover-up. The man who had disappeared right after Michael died. Lily's hands clenched around the edges of the folder. "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan's gaze darkened. "That's what we're going to find out." 2 days later, Jonathan and Greg sat in a sleek black SUV parked outside an unassuming house on the outskirts of Chicago. Wilson had vanished for over a decade. His record scrubbed, his existence erased, but Greg had found a crack in the foundation. A tiny financial trail leading to this house, a place where Wilson had been seen 3 days ago. Jonathan tightened his grip on the leather steering wheel. His pulse pounded in his ears. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Greg's voice was steady. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Jonathan turned to him, his jaw set in stone. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Greg nodded. "Then let's get your answers." They stepped out of the car and moved toward the front door. Jonathan's heart slammed against his ribs as Greg knocked once. Firmly. No answer. Greg knocked again. Still nothing. Jonathan exhaled sharply. No more waiting. He reached for the handle, turned it, and the door swung open. The house was empty. Jonathan stepped inside, his breath shallow, his senses sharp. The air was thick with dust, the furniture covered with old sheets. A single lamp flickered in the corner, casting eerie shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Something felt wrong. Greg scanned the room, looks abandoned. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. No, someone was here, recently. He moved deeper into the house, his pulse quickening. Papers were scattered across a wooden table, old documents, faded photographs, handwritten notes, and then, a single name scrawled across the page. Michael Mercer. Jonathan's blood turned to ice. His hands trembled as he picked up the paper, his throat tightening. It was a list of payments, transactions, and dates, spanning years. And at the bottom, circled in red ink, Elena Davis. Jonathan barely heard Greg's sharp intake of breath beside him. "Jesus," Greg muttered, "this isn't just a cover-up. This is a hit list." Jonathan swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the paper. Michael's death, Elena's disappearance. It had all been orchestrated. Paid for. By who? And then, from the hallway, a creak. Greg's hand went to his gun instantly. Jonathan's breath stalled in his chest. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Then, a figure stepped into view. Jonathan's heart nearly stopped. Henry Wilson. Wilson's eyes darted between them, calculating his next move. He was older now, thinner, his face hollowed out by years of running. But Jonathan recognized the fear in his gaze. Wilson knew exactly why they were here. "Wilson," Jonathan said coldly. The man swallowed hard. "Mercer, Jonathan slammed the paper onto the table. "Start talking." Wilson's hands trembled as he stared at the hit list. "You don't understand." Jonathan slammed his fist onto the table, sending papers flying. "No more lies." His voice was a low growl. "You knew my son. You knew Elena Davis. What happened to them?" Wilson's breathing turned ragged. "I didn't have a choice." Jonathan's rage burned like fire in his chest. "What did you do?" Wilson's voice cracked. "Michael, he found something he shouldn't have. He came to me. He was going to expose them." Jonathan's stomach churned. "Expose who? Who did this?" Jonathan demanded. "Who ordered his death?" Wilson squeezed his eyes shut. "The board." Jonathan went completely still. His entire body went numb. His own board of directors. The people he had trusted. They had ordered his son's murder. Jonathan's breath came in ragged gasps. His vision blurred with fury. "And Elena?" His voice was deadly quiet. Wilson hesitated. "She tried to run. She thought she could get away with the truth. But they." Jonathan took a slow, dangerous step forward. "They what?" Wilson's face crumpled with fear. "She's gone, Mercer. They made sure of it." Jonathan's heart stopped. Gone. Elena was gone. His hands trembled with uncontained rage. They had taken his son. They had taken his granddaughter's mother. And now, Jonathan was going to take everything from them. Wilson coughed, his breath unsteady. "I kept the records. Everything. They'll come after me if they know." Jonathan leaned in, his voice a lethal whisper. "They're already coming. And now, so am I." Hours later, back at the Mercer estate, Jonathan stood in his study, staring at the documents Wilson had given him. Lily stood beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "They killed them," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jonathan exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the burning fury in his chest. "They won't get away with it," he said, his voice like steel. Lily turned to him, her blue eyes shining with anger and pain. "You promise?" Jonathan's jaw clenched. He had spent 11 years believing he had lost Michael to a tragic accident. But now, he knew the truth. They had stolen his son. And they had left his granddaughter to suffer alone. Jonathan placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. I swear to you, he said, his voice unshaken, I will burn their world to the ground. Do you believe Jonathan should seek revenge? Comment below. What would you do if you found out your family was taken from you? Share this to show your support, because the fight isn't over. Subscribe for the next part, because the reckoning is coming. Jonathan Mercer had spent his entire life believing that power protected you. That if you built high enough walls, if you surrounded yourself with the right people, if you controlled every detail, you would be untouchable. But tonight, as he stood in the ruins of everything he had built, he realized just how wrong he had been. Because power didn't protect him. It had made him a target. The Mercer estate, once a symbol of strength, was now violated. The study, his sanctuary, was in shambles. Drawers had been ripped open. Papers scattered. Books torn from shelves and thrown across the floor. The glass from his liquor cabinet crunched under his polished shoes as he stepped forward. His chest tight with fury. And there, in the center of the chaos, a single white lily. Jonathan's breath came sharply, his stomach twisting into knots. It was a message, a taunt, a warning. They knew he was getting close. They knew he was coming for them. Lily stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The firelight flickered against her dark hair, casting shadows across her face. But her blue eyes were blazing. They were here, she whispered. Jonathan turned to her. She looked small in the dim light, her frame tense, as if she were waiting for the ground to collapse beneath her. She had already lost so much. A mother, a father she never got to know. And now, they were coming for her too. Jonathan clenched his fists. No, not this time, not again. Pack a bag, he said, his voice steel. We're leaving. They drove in silence. Jonathan's mind raced as the city lights blurred past the window. Who had done this? Who had broken into his home? His life? Left that single white lily as a reminder that they were watching? The board. The same people who had ordered Michael's death. The same people who had erased Elena. And now, they wanted to make sure Lily disappeared, too. Jonathan's jaw tightened as he gripped the steering wheel. They weren't going to win. Lily sat beside him, curled into herself, staring out the window. Her fingers twitched in her lap, nervous energy. A barely contained storm. I don't want to run, she said finally. Jonathan glanced at her. This isn't running. Lily's gaze snapped to his. Sharp and defiant. Then what is it? Jonathan exhaled, his voice calmer than he felt. It's buying us time. Lily shook her head. Time for what? They already know where we are. They've already taken everything from us. And now, her voice broke for the first time. And she swallowed hard. Now, they're just waiting to finish it. Jonathan pulled the car over abruptly, the tires screeching against the pavement. Lily jumped, looking at him with wide, startled eyes. Jonathan turned to face her fully, his voice low, steady, unshakable. No one is finishing anything, he said. Lily's breath came in shaky gasps. But she didn't look away. They killed my father, she whispered. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. She had never said it out loud before. She had never claimed Michael as hers the way she did now. They killed my father, she repeated, her voice stronger this time. And they took my mother. And now, they're trying to make sure I don't exist. Jonathan reached out, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. They won't, he said simply. Lily's blue eyes flickered, uncertain. How do you know? Jonathan exhaled. Because I won't let them. Because I already lost my son. Because I won't lose you, too. Instead, he said, because you're my family. Lily's lips pressed together tightly. She wanted to believe him. But she had spent her whole life learning not to trust promises. Jonathan's fingers curled into a fist. Then I'll prove it. The safe house was a penthouse in an undisclosed location, one of Jonathan's private properties. Secured and untraceable. Or at least, it was supposed to be. Because the moment they stepped inside, Jonathan knew something was wrong. The air felt too still. The silence too deliberate. Then, a phone rang. Jonathan's breath stopped. He turned sharply, searching for the sound. There, a burner phone sat on the kitchen counter, vibrating against the marble. Slowly, deliberately, Jonathan picked it up and pressed answer. A voice, low, mechanical, distorted. You were warned. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? A pause. Then, a slow, deliberate chuckle. Still asking the wrong questions. Mercer. Jonathan's blood ran cold. You should have left it alone. The voice continued, almost amused. You should have accepted what happened to your son. To the girl's mother. You should have let ghosts stay buried. Jonathan clenched his jaw. I don't take orders from cowards who hide behind phones. The voice hummed. No, I suppose you don't. That's why we had to remind you who's in charge. Jonathan's pulse roared in his ears. Then, a single, sinking realization. If they had found the estate. If they had found this number. Then, his head snapped toward Lily. her face drained of color. Because just outside the window, a figure stood across the street. Watching. Waiting. Jonathan's body moved before his mind even caught up. He dropped the phone, grabbed Lily by the arm, and yanked her away from the window. Move. Now. She didn't hesitate. They were out the door within seconds. Jonathan's mind in overdrive. The car was waiting. A backup plan he had prepared days ago, just in case. And thank God he had. Because this was no longer about exposing the truth. This was a war. And if they had thought he was dangerous before, they had no idea what was coming next. They drove through the night, neither of them speaking, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and Lily's shallow breathing beside him. Jonathan knew what he had to do now. The board thought they were untouchable. They thought they could erase his son, his granddaughter. They thought they could erase him. Jonathan's grip tightened on the wheel. They were wrong. They had started this, but he was going to finish it. Jonathan Mercer had never feared war. He had built his empire with his own 2 hands, clawed his way to the top of industries that had tried to destroy him, and outmaneuvered men who thought themselves untouchable. But this war? This wasn't about money. This wasn't about power. This was about family. And Jonathan had already lost too much. He sat in the dim glow of his study, staring at the surveillance footage playing on the laptop in front of him. Greg Turner had sent it just hours ago. The images were grainy, captured from a street camera near his estate, just minutes before the break-in. A black car parked just down the road. A man stepping out, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the night. Jonathan rewound the footage for the 10th time. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but he couldn't look away. The man paused at the end of the driveway, glancing toward the house. Then, without hesitation, he placed something at the gate. Jonathan already knew what it was. A single white lily. A warning. They had come too close. They had pushed too far. And now, the people who had killed Michael, who had erased Elena, were making it clear. Back off, or watch everything burn. Jonathan clenched his jaw. He had spent 11 years believing his son's death was an accident. He had spent 11 years in the dark, mourning a lie. Now, he knew the truth, and he wasn't backing down. Footsteps echoed in the hall. Jonathan turned just as Lily stepped into the room, her dark hair tangled from sleep, her oversized sweater hanging off one shoulder. She hesitated when she saw the laptop, her blue eyes flickering with something fragile, something dangerous. "What is it?" she asked, her voice raw from sleep. Jonathan hesitated for half a second. Then, he turned the screen toward her. Lily moved closer, her arms wrapped around herself. She watched in silence as the footage played. The car, the man, the flower. Jonathan didn't take his eyes off her as he spoke. "They wanted us to find this." Lily's breath hitched. "They know where we are," she whispered. Jonathan nodded once. "And they want us scared." Lily's fingers curled into her sweater, her whole body rigid. "Well, it's working." Jonathan exhaled slowly. He had spent decades shielding himself from emotions. He had learned to compartmentalize, to make decisions without weakness, without hesitation. But with Lily, he couldn't lie. He stood, crossing the room until he was in front of her. He reached out, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "We're not running," he said, his voice firm. Lily's jaw tightened. "They already took my mother," she murmured. "They took my father. And now," she broke off, her voice cracking. Jonathan's grip tightened. "No," he said sharply. "They won't take anything else." For a moment, Lily just stared at him. Then, finally, she nodded. Because she wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. And Jonathan? He would make damn sure he didn't fail her. An hour later, Greg arrived at the estate. Jonathan met him in the study, the air between them thick with unspoken urgency. Greg dropped a thick folder onto the desk, his face unreadable. "I found him." Jonathan's chest tightened. "Who?" Greg tapped the folder. "The man from the surveillance footage. He's not just some enforcer. Jonathan, he's the enforcer." Jonathan flipped open the folder, his breath slowing as he read the name. Victor Hale. The same name that had come up when Elena vanished. The same name that had been linked to Michael's death. Jonathan's blood boiled. Greg leaned back against the desk, arms crossed. "Hale has been working for the board for over a decade. They use him for their dirtiest jobs, cleaning up loose ends." Jonathan's fists tightened. Michael hadn't just been a casualty of corporate politics. He had been a loose end. And Elena? She had been the last thread they needed to cut. Greg exhaled. "Jonathan, listen to me. If you go after Hale, you're not just exposing the board. You're putting a target on your back." Jonathan's gaze darkened. Good. That night, Jonathan made a decision. No more waiting. No more playing by the rules. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. Michael had died because he found something he wasn't supposed to. Elena had disappeared for the same reason. And now, they wanted Lily gone, too. Jonathan wouldn't let that happen. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, he made a phone call. Not to the police. Not to his lawyers. To someone who would make sure Hale never walked away from this. Greg sighed heavily when he heard Jonathan's plan. You're really doing this? Jonathan's voice was ice. I should have done it a long time ago. 3 days later, Jonathan stood in an empty warehouse. The sound of dripping water echoing in the cavernous space. Across from him, Victor Hale sat in a metal chair, his wrists zip tied behind his back. Greg's men had found him first. Jonathan had made sure he was the last thing Hale saw. The enforcer wasn't smirking anymore. Jonathan stepped forward, his polished shoes echoing off the concrete. He crouched in front of Hale, looking him in the eye. You killed my son, he said quietly. Hale said nothing. Jonathan tilted his head. And you tried to erase my granddaughter. A slow, bitter smile curled at the corner of Hale's mouth. They won't stop, he muttered, even if you take me out. Mercer, you'll never stop them all. Jonathan studied him for a long moment. Then, he stood, and said, watch me. The following night, Jonathan burned every last file exposing the board's corruption into a dozen USB drives. He handed one to Greg, one to Lily, one to a journalist whose name had been whispered across secret investigations for years. This wasn't just about taking them down. This was about making sure they could never rebuild. Lily stood beside him, the wind howling through the city streets. They're going to come after us, she said. Jonathan nodded. Let them. Lily exhaled, watching the drive in her hands. Then, a small, defiant smile. Burn them to the ground, she said. Jonathan smirked. Oh, I plan to. Jonathan Mercer had spent his entire life building something that would last. A legacy, a name that meant something. But now, he realized something painful. His legacy didn't matter. His money didn't matter. His power, his influence, his empire, none of it had saved his son. None of it had saved Elena. None of it had protected his granddaughter. Jonathan stood in his study, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a lead blanket. The fire crackled behind him, casting his reflection in the glass of the towering windows. His fingers curled into fists. For 11 years, he had grieved a lie. Now, he knew the truth, and the people responsible were still out there. Jonathan had spent his entire career playing by the rules. But now, he was done playing. The silence in the room was shattered by the sound of footsteps. Jonathan turned as Lily stepped into the study, her blue eyes sharp, filled with something he hadn't seen before. Conviction. She was ready. She was tired of running. I know what you're planning, she said quietly. Jonathan said nothing. Lily took another step closer. You're going after them. Jonathan exhaled slowly, studying her carefully. She had spent her whole life in the dark. She had grown up with questions that had no answers, pain that had no closure. And now, he could see the fire in her. She wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. She was fighting for herself. Jonathan nodded once. I am. Lily's hands clenched at her sides. Then I'm going with you. Jonathan's chest tightened. You don't have to do this, he said. Lily's eyes flashed. Yes, I do. For the first time since this started, Jonathan realized something. Lily wasn't just Michael's daughter. She was Michael. She had his determination, his fury, his refusal to walk away when something was wrong. And that's why they had killed him. Because Michael had been too much like Jonathan. And now, Lily had taken up the same fight. Jonathan exhaled, his shoulders heavy with the weight of it all. Then we do this together. Lily's lips pressed into a thin line. And for the first time since she walked into his life, she looked like she believed him. Greg arrived an hour later, his face grim. I traced the offshore accounts, he said, dropping a thick file onto Jonathan's desk. Jonathan's stomach twisted. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. Greg's voice was steady. It all leads back to the board. Jonathan wasn't surprised. But then, Greg hesitated. And Jonathan felt his pulse slow. What? He demanded. Greg's jaw clenched. There's more. Jonathan reached for the file and flipped it open. Inside was a signature. A contract. And at the bottom, his own name. Jonathan's vision blurred. His own company. His own board. They had used his name. They had used his empire to cover up his son's murder. He had been signing away Michael's life without even knowing it. Jonathan's hands shook as he slammed the file shut. Greg exhaled slowly. They used your reputation to cover their tracks, he said. If this gets out, it won't just take them down. It'll take you down, too. Jonathan didn't care. He looked at Lily. At his granddaughter, the last piece of Michael he had left. I built this company, he said, his voice low. And if I had to burn it to the ground to get justice, then so be it. Lily's blue eyes darkened. And she didn't stop him. The board had called an emergency meeting. Jonathan arrived alone. He walked into that boardroom, knowing exactly what this was. A final warning. A last chance to walk away. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, his hands steady, his expression unreadable. Marcus Sullivan leaned back in his chair, his smirk confident. You're making a mistake, he said. Jonathan didn't blink. The only mistake I made was trusting you. Jennifer Kane crossed her arms. If you go public with this, Jonathan, you won't just be destroying us. You'll be destroying yourself. Jonathan smiled. I can live with that. A ripple of tension spread through the room. Marcus's smirk faltered. You're bluffing. Jonathan leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. No, he said, I'm not. And then, he slid the USB drive across the table. Everything you've done, every bribe, every payment, every cover-up, it's all here. It's already been sent to the press, to the SEC, to the FBI. The room exploded into chaos. Shouting, panicked voices. Jennifer slammed a fist on the table. You son of a... Jonathan cut her off with a calm, cold stare. I let you take my son. The room fell silent. Jonathan's voice was deadly quiet. I let you take Elena. Marcus's face was pale now. Jonathan exhaled, his rage controlled, but still burning. But I will not let you take my granddaughter. A beat of silence. Then, he turned and walked out of the room. And he didn't look back. The news broke within hours. The scandal exploded across headlines. The entire board was arrested. The company? It collapsed. Everything Jonathan had built? Gone. But as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, staring at the city below, he didn't feel regret. He felt relief. He felt free. Lily stepped beside him, arms crossed against the wind. They're going to come after you, she murmured. Jonathan nodded. I know. She exhaled, glancing at him. But you did all again, wouldn't you? Jonathan turned to her, his expression unreadable. Yes, he said simply. I would. Because his name didn't matter. His legacy didn't matter. Only she did. Michael's daughter. His granddaughter. The last piece of his family worth fighting for. Jonathan reached out, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. You're safe now, he said. Lily's eyes glistened. And for the first time since he met her, she believed him. The world had changed. The company Jonathan Mercer had spent a lifetime building lay in ruins. Reduced to headlines and court cases. The empire he had once thought would stand the test of time had crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. But Jonathan was still standing. And more importantly, so was Lily. The board members who had orchestrated Michael's murder and Elena's disappearance were now behind bars. The justice system had taken over. The world had turned its eyes toward the scandal. And for the first time in over a decade, the truth had won. But it had come at a cost. Jonathan had lost everything, except what mattered. Now, standing on the porch of a quiet home far away from the chaos, Jonathan watched as Lily sat on the steps, staring at the sky. The weight on her shoulders was different now, no longer the burden of secrets, but the weight of freedom. She wasn't the same girl who had walked into his life. She was stronger, she was unbreakable, and she was finally safe. Jonathan stepped forward, his footsteps soft against the wooden porch. Lily turned, her blue eyes calm for the first time. You ever think about what's next? She asked, her voice quiet. Jonathan exhaled slowly. For so long, his life had been about fighting. Fighting for answers. Fighting for justice. Fighting for revenge. And now? Now, there was nothing left to fight. Now, there was only life. He sat beside her, folding his hands over his lap. I don't know, he admitted, for the first time in a long time. I don't have a plan. Lily smirked. That's a first. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. But then, Lily's expression turned serious. You didn't have to do all of this for me, she said quietly. Jonathan frowned. Yes, I did. Lily exhaled, glancing away. I wasn't your responsibility. Jonathan felt something stir deep in his chest. For 11 years, he had lived believing Michael was gone forever. That the only thing he had left was regret. But then, Lily showed up. A living, breathing part of Michael's story that hadn't been erased. Jonathan reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're my family, he said, and family is always my responsibility. Lily's breath hitched. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she nodded. Jonathan leaned back, looking at the sky, feeling the weight of the past lift just a little. And for the first time in over a decade, he let himself breathe. The past could not be rewritten. Michael was gone. Elena had disappeared without a trace. And Jonathan had paid the price for uncovering the truth. But as he looked at Lily, he realized something. He had spent his whole life chasing a legacy built on power and wealth. But in the end, his greatest legacy wasn't the company he built. It was her. It was the choice he made to stand for something greater than himself. And that was the lesson. The truth always matters. Family is worth fighting for. And no matter how much power the world thinks it has, justice always finds a way. Jonathan turned to Lily. You know, he said, you never told me what you want to do next. Lily smirked. I'm thinking, law school. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Law school? She nodded. Someone has to make sure people like them never get away with something like this again. Jonathan let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. Michael would have been so damn proud. And so was he. This story teaches us something important. When you stand for the truth, the world will try to break you. But you keep going. You keep fighting. Because the truth matters. Because justice matters. And because some things are worth more than money. More than power. Some things are worth everything. Jonathan Mercer lost everything to uncover the truth about his son. But in the end, he won something far greater. A family. A future. A reason to keep moving forward. Do you believe Jonathan made the right choice? Comment below. What would you have done in his place? Share this story to inspire others, because justice is worth fighting for. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories just like this. This isn't just a story. This is a reminder that no matter how dark the truth is, it always deserves to come to light.